So let's dive into one of the most tense and defining rivalries in all of modern history, the Cold War. I mean, this is the big question, right? The United States and the Soviet Union, they fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany. So how on earth did they go from being allies to being mortal enemies, bringing the entire world to the very brink of nuclear war? Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into. Okay, so our story really kicks off the second the fighting in Europe stops. The common enemy that held this fragile alliance together was gone, and all those deep-seated differences they'd been ignoring during the war, they came roaring right back to the surface. And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the conflict. You have to understand, this was never just a rivalry between two powerful countries. Nope. This was a clash between two completely fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. On one side, you've got American capitalism, all about private ownership and free markets, with a goal of keeping communism from spreading. And on the other, Soviet communism, where the state owns everything and the goal is a worldwide revolution. There was just no real middle ground. And you can actually see that mistrust building up, step by step, even while they were supposed to be allies. Back at the Tehran conference, yeah, they were cooperating, but they were already arguing over what to do with Poland. A couple years later, at Yalta, they agree on dividing Germany, but nobody in the West really believes Stalin when he promised free elections in Eastern Europe. And then, Potsdam. Roosevelt is gone, Truman is the new president, and he's a much tougher character. Plus, he knows something Stalin doesn't. The US has successfully tested the atomic bomb. That changed everything. The alliance was, for all intents and purposes, dead. So with that wartime alliance completely shattered, the ideological divide we were just talking about becomes a hard physical reality. A line is literally drawn right through the heart of Europe. And it was Winston Churchill who gave this new reality a name that would stick forever. In a famous speech in 1946, he said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." It was the perfect, chilling description of this new separation between the democratic West and the Soviet-controlled East. So what was America's strategy? It all came down to one word: containment. And it was a brilliant two-pronged attack. First, you had the Truman Doctrine, which was basically a promise of military and political support to any country fighting off a communist takeover. Then came the Marshall Plan, this absolute economic juggernaut pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding war-torn Europe. The idea was simple: prosperous nations don't turn to communism. Of course, Stalin saw all of this as a direct attack. So what did he do? He tightened his grip. He created something called Cominform to make sure every communist party in Europe took their orders directly from Moscow. And he set up Comecon, which was the Soviet version of the Marshall Plan, basically walling off Eastern Europe's economy and forbidding any of those countries from taking American money. And all this tension finally boils over in Berlin. Now remember, the city is deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but half of it is controlled by the West. When the Western powers introduce a new, stable currency there, Stalin sees it as a provocation. So he makes a huge move. He blockades West Berlin, cuts off all roads, all trains, all canals. He's trying to starve them out, figuring the West will just give up and leave. But they didn't, not even close. Instead, they launched the Berlin Airlift, an incredible operation, flying in food and supplies 24/7 for nearly a year. So, in the end, Stalin's big power play completely backfired. Not only did he fail to force the West out of Berlin, but the whole crisis directly led to the official creation of two separate German states. You had West Germany and East Germany, and for the next 40 years, they would be the ultimate symbol of a divided continent. Okay, so the battle lines are drawn. The rivalry is set in stone, but the stakes, well, the stakes are about to get infinitely, terrifyingly higher. The political fight is about to become a full-blown nuclear standoff. You see, for the Soviets, Berlin was still a massive headache. It was this little loophole in the Iron Curtain. And just look at this number: 3 million East Germans, many of them doctors, engineers, skilled workers. They just walked across the border in Berlin and into the West. This was a catastrophic brain drain for the communist East German government. So the communists did the most desperate, drastic thing you can imagine. Literally overnight, they sealed the border. They put up barbed wire, then started building a concrete wall that sliced the entire city in two. It worked, it stopped the flood of people leaving, but my God, it became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War. It was a prison wall, plain and simple. At almost the exact same time, another crisis was brewing, this time just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The CIA backed a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. It was an absolute humiliating disaster. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed miserably, and even worse, it pushed Castro right into the arms of the Soviet Union. And that new alliance led directly to this, the single most dangerous moment in human history. American spy planes discovered that the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, the entire planet held its breath as the two superpowers went eyeball to eyeball. Kennedy put a naval blockade around the island. Soviet ships steamed right towards it. A U.S. spy plane was shot down. We have never, ever been closer to all-out nuclear Armageddon. In the end, it was a back-channel deal that saved the world. Publicly, the Soviets agreed to pull their missiles out of Cuba, and the U.S. promised it would never invade the island. But here's the secret part. The U.S. also quietly agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey a little later on. It was a clever compromise that gave both leaders a way to back down without looking weak. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call like no other. It absolutely terrified everyone on both sides. It forced them to realize that they had to find a way to manage this rivalry because the alternative was wiping each other and the rest of us off the map. And this new way of thinking got a name, détente. It's a French word that basically means a relaxation of tensions. Now, the goal wasn't to suddenly become friends, no way. The goal was to establish some ground rules for the rivalry, to make sure a crisis like Cuba could never, ever happen again. And what happens next is this incredible flurry of diplomatic activity. Right after the crisis, you see all these agreements pop up. The Test Ban Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the SALT I Treaty. Both sides suddenly realized they needed to start talking, in fast. A huge piece of the puzzle was just basic communication. They set up the famous hotline. Not a red phone, but a direct teletype link. So the leaders in Washington and Moscow could talk to each other instantly in a crisis. And they started having regular summit meetings. The idea was to eliminate the risk of starting a nuclear war just because of a simple misunderstanding. The other big focus was getting a handle on the insane arms race. So you had the Test Ban Treaty, which banned all those dangerous nuclear tests in the atmosphere. You had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was an attempt to stop other countries from getting the bomb. And then SALT I, which was a huge deal, the first time ever the superpowers actually agreed to put a cap on the number of nuclear missiles they could have. Now, let's be really clear here. Détente did not end the Cold War, not by a long shot. The spying, the competition for influence around the globe, the ideological battle, all of that kept going. But now, there were rules. A new understanding had emerged. The Cold War had become a dangerous but manageable rivalry. Which really brings us to a final, big question. They built this whole system to manage an incredible global rivalry without destroying the planet. So you have to ask yourself, was it a true triumph of diplomacy and statesmanship? Or did we all just get incredibly lucky for half a century? It's something to think about.